Check 1, 2.
Is it me? Is it you? Well, no, not quite yet. Oh, you're on. Okay, not quite yet. Well, it is all about you, Rania. I'm all good with that. So we're going to call the meeting to order. It's like 6:06. And if we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. We do. We do. Manny's got the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. Thank you. And our roll call. Commissioner Sykes?
Present.
Commissioner Lewis, I think we knew was not going to be here this evening, and he indicated he'll be watching the video. Commissioner Roy?
Here.
Thank you. Commissioner Clark is absent. Commissioner Hybels?
Present.
Commissioner Ewan?
Present.
And Commissioner Jones appears to be absent, though he may still arrive. I didn't hear that he wasn't going to be here. Okay, with that, now it's Ranya's turn. Welcome back, Ranya. She is going to take the first cut this evening, which is the module on trauma-informed care. And then we will be having a different presenter who will be on Zoom this evening on the constitutional rights related to law enforcement, which is your second PowerPoint that you have before you this evening. When we are finished this evening, that finishes all of the commission's, I'm going to call them mandatory initial training. And then we will be moving into what the chief has as supplemental for you. He's not listening to me at the moment. Sorry, Chief. What the chief has as supplemental training for you. We're trying to get a clear picture of who's missed which ones, so we can send you a list of which ones any of you have missed. And Manny slash Naveed will be stacking up all of the videos in one easy to find place, which we will send you the URL to, so that you all can pick which ones. We'll label them by topic, and you can pick the ones that you may have missed, and then we'll ask you to sign a certification that you watched them. So that's how we're going to close out this, the mandatory training sessions, or the initial mandatory training sessions. And then we'll reach back out when the chief adds the additional items. And then, Chief, who do you want them to schedule their ride-alongs with or through? Do you want them to do that through Rashad? With Kristen. Okay. So we'll send you an email about scheduling those ride-alongs through Kristen, and she'll help you to find dates that are convenient, dates and times that are convenient at work for you. Okay. Well, with that, take it away, Rania.
I think I got this one. Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. Nice to be back. My name is Rania Adwan. Thank you for having me. Thank you to members of the public that are in the audience behind me and those that might be tuning in. As Veronica mentioned, this is the last of the ones I have for you, and we are doing trauma-informed oversight. I am not credentialed. I just want to make sure that I preface this training is also not to get you to be trauma-informed carers or facilitators either. So you are not credentialed after this. However, we're touching on the principles so that you are aware, and if anyone is interested, we can certainly find you. And actually, in one of the resources, I'll show you the toolkit where you can go and carry on some of the training. But the idea, again, is more about making you aware of some of the things that are going on nationally that have changed, and that now starts to come into oversight that you can use and, more importantly, be aware of. So trauma-informed, it's a little bit of a buzzword and a bit trendy. Not everyone likes it, but I think it's really important. And if you can't already tell, this is really going to come up in your role on the commission in a number of different ways. Okay, next slide, please. That's not at all the next slide. Sorry, Manny. That's slide 10. It's all right.
Big jump.
No worries. Any questions while we're waiting? Anything struck you over the last few sessions that we've done together? You're ready. I like it. Has anyone stopped you in a grocery store yet?
They're not readily recognizable yet. Commission, while we're waiting for Manny to come get that back up, I'd like to introduce you to and let your new commissioner, who will be joining you shortly, who has joined us this evening, just introduce herself.
Thank you. So I'm Rami Qualls. I'm the new elect for District 1. I've been in Vallejo about 3.5 years. Pretty much lived in Contra Costa County all my life. Retired from Contra Costa County Health Services after 30 years. And I'm currently the foreperson for the civil grand jury. So my term for that ends the end of June. So here I am. So thank you.
Well, welcome and thank you for all of your public service. And look, we're up.
And we're up. So again, just a quick reminder of where we've been. That first one was really kind of an overview and really kind of double down on your integrity and how we touched on a lot of different things that then I think we double clicked on. We talked about your role and responsibility. For the next one, we went over the first round of rules, right? We did anti-discrimination, bias, racial justice, I think we did. But we covered your rules. By the time we got to procedural justice, we started talking about how your rules start to affect or how it will manifest into your processes, right? So if we're being mindful of bias, what does that look like as we start doing some of the work? And finally, into tonight, how trauma shapes behavior. So what you see or what you might be seeing as folks start to come into your meetings, what you might be feeling yourself. I want to preface and say that I'm a bit nervous about this one because I have my own trauma. So I'm going to be using some of that as an example. I'm going to ask you to reflect on your own. We don't have to share it. I will try not to share too much. Nobody wants to see me cry. But I think it's important that we're aware of what's happening to other people and what's happening to ourselves. We self-reflect, we try and heal so that you can show up and be better for the person that you're about to take care of. So the key takeaways for today, what is it? When you keep hearing these things, what is trauma informed? What does triggering mean? All of these buzzwords, how it might show up. What do you need to do about it, if anything, or what can you be doing about it? Again, I don't expect you to intervene. I don't expect you to be a trauma-informed specialist, but I do just want to share with you what we know so that you can be more aware. All right, moving on. Next up, please, Manny. So here we are again. You know, I love mere definition, so we all kind of have the same understanding when I say trauma. And this is also, I've kind of amalgamated a couple of things that I was reading and I've sourced it. Trauma is a lasting impact of an overwhelming experience on the body, mind, and nervous system. It can disrupt a person's sense of safety, control, or connection. That's the definition I'm using. I grabbed that from a few places. There's the SAMHSA, the SAMHSA. They are the main folks that I kind of went to and again resourced. But a lot of the principles, a lot of what we're about to see comes from them. It is a mental health and behavioral agency, government agency. The 3 E's of trauma. So how it even happens when we say trauma, what is even it? It is an event, what's happened, it's an experience, something I felt, it's an effect, a leave behind. So not everyone goes through the same, that we can go, or Commissioner Yoon and I can be in the same car crash or the same horrible incident and both have a very different outcome, both be moved quite differently, right? Like depending on what's happened, how we shape, how we move generally. The types of trauma, and we'll get into this a little bit more, individual, myself, the collective, maybe me and my neighborhood, me and my area, me and my city, historical and generational. I'm sure you guys have heard about generational trauma, right? And how that might show up. And of course, systemic. So the systemic stuff, the individual, actually all of it is some of the reasons that you are here. The systemic stuff that we'll be looking at is some of the public safety stuff, right? This is disruptive. Oversight tends to be a disruptor to a system and now becomes a new system. Okay. So the 3 E's, the way that I frame it, explains how trauma takes hold and the types of trauma, where it comes from, if that helps in terms of your framing. Any thoughts or questions about that?
No, I was just gonna let the commission and the public know that the city manager is actually participating with us this evening online, so he is available tonight and here with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm not going to move on for just a second, but instead just kind of, again, this, I'm just going to share some illustrative things that might help kind of, again, frame and bring things to life for you so they don't seem so theoretical. So unless you want to, I've not made this interactive because it was trauma. So I wanted to be very mindful. Can you think of or imagine an event that might be traumatic? Really open. You're welcome to do policing. A stop, an interaction, a police interaction that didn't go well. That could be traumatic, right? And I'll put stuff in appendix if you find it helpful. An experience that came off that, maybe the loss of control. Suddenly I am in a position where I am definitely subordinate to a dominant authority figure, even if it feels, especially if it feels unjust. And of course, the lasting traumatic effect could be many, but maybe it's anxiety. So now every time I see a cop, I might feel some kind of way. It might make me drive better. It might make me just more anxious, more scared. And I might have a behavior that is actually counter to what is expected of me. And we'll kind of get into that. I won't do them all, but I can share in an appendix if it's helpful to kind of see those illustrations. The generational trauma that you might be seeing again, hopefully these aren't surprising. You know, policing, at least in this country, has strong associations, if not born out of slavery and that era of history, right? Again, I'm not trying to take sides or be polarizing. It is a fact. That is what happened. And so some of the generational stuff that you might be seeing comes off the back of that from both sides, from all sides. I'll stop there, unless you need Commissioner Hybels.
I'm afraid I don't know what you are driving at by generational trauma.
Oh, okay. So perhaps I can be, am I allowed to, I'll be a little personal on this one. My family's Palestinian. They were expelled in the Nakba. I still have issues around hoarding food. That's a generational trauma that I didn't even realize I picked up because there was a scarcity. Same, I imagine if there are folks that have family that experienced the Holocaust, same, Black communities that might have experienced, you know, if they came off from slavery, that's generational trauma. Those little habits that come up that you're like, wait, that's just what my mum did. Actually, that's trauma, you know, that's trauma. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah, okay. We'll move on. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay. I will share a bit more of an appendix if it's helpful. I just didn't want to I don't want to over-index trauma more than some of the others. It's all just as important. Next slide, please, Manny. So, I've got my slides out of order. Oh, sorry. Notes. So why this matters. Oversight intersects with trauma. One of the reasons that we're here is because there's been an interaction between an officer and a member of the community that didn't go well, or something happened, right? Whether it was perceived, whether it was fact, whether it was real. That means that you're about to experience or hear trauma in multiple or many stakeholders. It's a community member that's giving you public comment. It's someone, again, that's meeting you in a grocery store and really hoping that you're going to fix it. I had a bad interaction. You've got to tell those cops. It's an officer that you're about to hear from as part of an investigation, or an officer that you think did a thing and so you want to know more about, right? They might also be traumatized. It's the system. Things are unfair. There are things you can't do. We've been talking about some of that. Even as I've been kind of pushing you to consider transparency, for example, there are legalities that make it that you can't share everything. You just can't, even if you want to, even if the community really wants you to, part of the system. So that's kind of where, or as you're going to start intersecting or kind of really exposing or being exposed to trauma rather, I found it, and I think I shared this in our last session as we were talking about bias and procedural justice, the rules, and that's why I've put that up. It all really merges for me, and I find it really difficult to kind of pull apart, and all to show you that for me, at least, it's all interconnected. And so I wanted to point out that trauma can show up in bias. I would say that we all have our biases. How it might show up, again, that angry Black woman, right? That stereotype. Well, that might be trauma manifesting. That's an expression of anger or a cultural expression that comes out that is misrepresented or misinterpreted in this culture. Yeah, I've been in spaces where I've been told to fix my face because I'm very expressive. I can't play poker, but you'll definitely know how I'm feeling. So that's bias starts getting mixed up for me when it comes to trauma. And so again, I'm just like extra mindful, and sometimes I'm not because I'm human. And so I try and slow down and come back to the person. I'm sorry, are you okay? And we'll kind of start talking about some of that. But I just wanted to share where it starts to even cross over in some of the other trainings that we've covered. So bias, I think, is really important. And then the structural bias, right? So we still, even in this country, have structural biases against certain communities. We just do. Again, I just want to be mindful, but I'll point it out. But I've given you an example here. So I've mentioned, say, Black communities. Another example is the LGBTQ plus community, where there's a whole conversation now about what happens with trans people. There's trauma in their bodies. There's trauma in the system for them. And again, it comes up in bias. In procedural justice, a little less so, but again, if you think of procedural justice as the how, so making sure that your how is very fair, very just, very respectful, this is where you might want to be mindful of trauma-informed practices. Can I make it a safe space? Again, a trendy word. What do we mean by a safe space? I don't mean to be condescending. I'm genuinely curious as to how you understand safe spaces, if anyone feels comfortable enough to share. What your definition or how you understand safe space. Well, you've got the floor, Commissioner Hyballs. Can I put you on the spot?
Well, I don't know. I've been robbed at gunpoint 3 times in my life, but I'm not experiencing any effects of that whatsoever. So I'm not sure.
Okay.
I
Well,
feel very safe
well,
typically.
I'm so sorry to hear about your experiences, but I am glad that you feel safe. I wonder if there's safe space for your community then as a commissioner. Can you give me an example? No. Okay. No worries. Thank you. Commissioner Yoon?
Just listening without judgment and letting them speak.
Fantastic. I'd say that was emotional safety, psychological safety.
Both.
Good.
I think people like to express their emotions, and
Right.
there is a fear of judgment that comes along with it. And I think a safe space is allowing them to speak their mind
Right.
without having this idea that they may be judged or
Yeah.
felt some type of way
Yeah.
in that sense.
I'll tell you what comes up for me as we're talking about that. The procedural justice point about, we talked last time about public comment, being really clear about the amount of time, right? Not responding, not answering. So that if I'm crying or having expressing big emotions on the dais, giving you public comment, giving me that, my time, and just honoring that with respect, I'd agree. I'd say that was a safe space. Anyone else?
I think people like to be acknowledged in some form or fashion. A lot of times people are ignored and felt they're not being heard. That ties in with Naomi's listening
Yeah.
component. So I think if you sometimes just by nodding, not saying that you're agreeing, but nodding, saying that I recognize and hear what you're saying, that you can kind of see the change in a person's presentation and demeanor. I also try and hear key words that come out of people, because whether they know it or not, they are telling what their trauma is by using a specific word.
Yeah.
And that usually you can kind of frame what the issue is and maybe hone in on it a
Yep.
little bit, not a lot, in terms of what that word, that key word, why that keyword is triggering for them.
Yeah, thank you. And again, in the spirit of procedural justice and process, that might show up as, thank you so much for that comment. That must have been difficult. I appreciate the share. We appreciate the share. It's a recognition. I agree. That makes for safety. Commissioner Roy?
Yeah, I was just going to add, making sure that the space is accessible and inclusive to everybody. I know that we've talked a lot about making sure that, everyone's able to understand what we're talking about, that they're able to speak in whatever language they're able to bring to
Yeah.
the space, and that we're not alienating anyone based on any biases, based on any particular groups or sections of people. I think making sure that it's inclusive is really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I'll add again and remind you that in the procedural justice module, in the how of that, you will get to decide, for example, if how the chief and say members of the VPD might show up at your meetings. Are they coming? Do you want them to come in uniform? Do you ask them to come not in uniform? Do you want to check with, you see what I'm saying? Like if you really want to be intentional, how do you want the room to look? What are we covering tonight? If it's a reasonably light agenda and it's nothing too controversial or intense, maybe it's fine. If there's a hearing, for example, or you are discussing the outcome of an investigation that's just been completed and say it was a particularly, let me give you an example. I'm in a jurisdiction on the East Coast, and their commission, I'm working with the oversight body, and it was a 2-year investigation on an incident. There was a demonstration. It was a Black Lives Matter demonstration, and the department, the police officers had moved the demonstrators in a manner that perceived as aggressive. Someone was hurt, back and forth, yada, yada. So 2 years in the making, right? So the community is hopped up. They are, right? They think they're going to win. It's in their favor. And if it's not, they're ready to do something about it. And the officers similarly. So you could tell that this was going to be charged. And so we worked together to make sure that the chief was going to be there. No officers, right? Because the community was just going to start lashing out, and you can tell that something was going to happen. So no officers. We encouraged them to invest in trauma-informed facilitators, so crisis management folk. If anyone kicked off, someone's going to come in, take them out of the room, pull them aside, not because it's drama or but because that person is clearly starting to get angry. They are re-triggered. That thing you did to me 2 years ago, that thing you did to my friend, right? So we invested in all of that. We went over the talking points several times, all of the things in an effort for them to be very intentional and very thoughtful about not re-traumatizing their community. So another way that safe space, another way that psychological safety starts coming up. You can just, you just learn to anticipate, or you really start indexing on that part of our storytelling. Ooh, that's a frisky story. That's a saucy story. That's going to be, let's be mindful about what's on the agenda. And then what do we need to do? And maybe it's nothing. Again, don't over index it. You don't need trauma informed all the time. You're just looking out for it. You're interrupting it. And you're definitely trying not to make it worse.
I think it's also important to think about the things that you don't think could be triggering, or you don't think could be controversial or upsetting, that can turn that way quickly. So consider you're considering a new policy on something, and people who believe that policy should go further or less far, or that policy should be completely different in a way, and they bring forward their personal experience to say, well, this policy needs to change because this happened to me. Well, normally a policy is all about what's the state of the law, what is the best practice, how do we write that into a policy that the department follows. Yet certainly other people with certain experiences may perceive that as a way to correct something, or a way for them to feel, I don't want to, heard. And so even when we're doing something simple, it can go there pretty quickly. And I think we need to be prepared in all instances for what could that look like. Many of the policies we have are very, I'll call them benign and boring, but some of the ones that have been worked on and will be worked on in the near future may not feel that way to members of the community. So I think it's important to just be watching for it in all instances, because you don't know when it might come up.
Thank you. And we'll get into some of that as well. Thanks for seeding that. Next slide, please, Manny. Okay. I just wanted to show, I use in my work and transformation work, we use the theories of change. So how change happens. And I found it really interesting that there was a kind of how trauma moves. And I just, again, maybe this, to your point, Commissioner Heibolds, about that generational. So a lot of the time it starts with the I, it starts with the individual. So it happens to me or my family, right? Then I start talking about it, or you're my neighbor, you experience it with me. Now you're just as scared or troubled, or and then it just kind of continues moving out. So I just wanted to show, since we've been talking about storytelling a lot, this is the the narrative arc of trauma, essentially, because historically, and then it kind of like it's a cycle, right? I get stuck generationally because now I heard my dad talk about it, my granddad talked about it, and we kind of keep bringing it up. There are means and ways of disrupting trauma and healing from it. It's one thing that we encourage. We can talk about mediation practices when you're ready to. There are also groups that I've engaged with that have been quite interesting, that do healing circles with community and cops. Those have been effective. You just need patience. The community also needs patience. So there's a lot of storytelling that you have to do, right, to set expectations, and we'll get to that because that's also both procedurally just and a trauma trigger. If you don't tell me what's happening, I'm going to expect that you're going to fix it in a night. Why haven't you fixed it? Why is it still hurting? Why isn't that cop been blah, 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 blah? Why is that person still out there? But instead you have to tell me that this is going to take a while. Like trauma takes a while to heal. But I just kind of wanted to illustrate that and show again, like the system that you're kind of coming into. Okay, next slide, please. This is where your job gets, you kind of have to operate on instinct. You're going to do the best that you can. Again, you're not specialists. I'm not asking you to be a specialist. I'm not asking you to be a counselor or a psychiatrist. I'm just asking you that as you come into these spaces to look after yourself, but also look after the bodies of the people that are coming in front of you. So it doesn't always show up as distress. I hear you, Commissioner Heibolds, about being stopped at gunpoint 3 times and you feel like it, and I'm not going to tell you whether you do or not, but I'm curious. I'd be curious about that without re-triggering you. So I'm not going to ask you now. But I want to share that you might not think that you've been traumatized, or trauma shows up differently in different people. And what I'm asking you to do with this one is consider that obstinate behavior, the belligerence might not be belligerence. It might well be. We're going through this not because I'm asking you to be lenient. I'm just asking you to be mindful, right? So you will recognize fight, flight, freeze, probably. Fawn is a newer term that's being used in psychology and behavioral studies that I quite like. But fight, right? That immediate psychological reaction of defensiveness when I'm being attacked or someone's coming at me. So an officer might be coming at me. I'm already traumatized, or maybe I'm about to be traumatized, and my instinct is to fight. That's not really what you want me to do. You want me to comply, ideally, but it's a defensive. It's too late. The adrenaline is surged in my system. My brain chemistry's changed and I'm off. So it might look like defiance, but actually I'm scared. It's a survival mechanism. Same with flight. Wait, they fled the scene, right? You might read that as you're, say, reviewing investigations or whatever. It might look like, again, running thing, something's going up that looks suspicious, might be something else. I'm not asking you to be lenient. I'm asking you to be balanced and just be mindful of it, right? Freeze, similarly, you don't see this too much, but that inability, you might see it in statements, you might see it if people are giving public comment, you might see it in a listening session or a town hall. These folks will you'll ask a question, or in a listening session, you're like, wait, but tell me that story, or give me the evidence, give me the data I need. And there's just that inability to kind of function, or the stuttering that might be something trauma related. It might be, I've put down here, might look like non-compliance, and it might just be overload. Again, I'm nervous now talking to you. We're together, but we're also on camera. I'm very aware, right? So that's That's not an inability to speak. I promise you, I can speak for ages. It's just the moment that I'm in and the nerves that I'm going through. And I mentioned fawn is the most recent addition that came up in these psychology books. And that's that over deference, right? And so if you start seeing community members being overly deferential to cops, again, not necessarily suspicious or not, or whatever that power dynamic is, that could be a trauma response. It's a survival mechanism. I'm just trying to get you away from me. Sometimes you're not even aware or conscious of your own trauma responses until, oh, sometimes you're just not. Sometimes if you're starting to practice or aware of it, you'll start to notice things in yourself, perhaps, or in other people around you. But freeze tends to show up a little bit more in kind of PTSD. Freeze shows up a bit in police interactions, right? Why aren't you, like an officer might start getting really aggressive. Why aren't you answering? Just fear. But again, that moment of interaction, the officer is just as in that moment as the person sometimes. Okay, next slide, please. So, making it practical. These again, I have borrowed, I've sourced it. This is from that same agency, SAMHSA. But I wanted to talk about what this means for you. So we'll go through them very quickly. So realizing that trauma is widespread, right? So again, just don't assume that someone who is calm and talking to you and normal, whatever that might mean, has such a spectrum. How am I doing today? How are we doing this week? What's happened? What's the hook? What reminded me? But for all intents and purposes, it's everywhere, comes up in different points. Just be aware, just know that the trauma exists in all of us in some way. Recognize the signs and symptoms. So what's about to happen? Am I jittery? Is my voice rising? Did something happen? Are we in a discussion and suddenly it's getting very heated? What of that is just passion? What of that is just energy? And what of that is like, okay, wait, did something happen? Like what's happening here? What am I watching? What am I looking at? Can I ask a question or do I just need to be mindful? Respond. Here's where maybe some of the example that Veronica just gave, right? What's the policy? So you're having a listening session, for example. You're meeting in community, and this particular community is aggrieved by what they feel is over policing or excessive use of force, right? We're realizing we've set a safe space. It's their space. The community has asked you to come. It's their space. We're doing all the listening, so we've got the emotional safety. So now your response, it might be, okay, let's go back and check that policy. Let's see if that policy warrants a review. Are there any recommendations to make it even better? Is there anything that we can do to address this? And then remember that procedural justice, how are we going to look at that policy? So I've just heard from impacted communities, or rather, I'm about to open up this policy and I'm about to ask impacted communities. I'm going to be real careful now about what I'm about to trigger and how I can set the space and it's also the questions that we're going to be asking so that you don't re-trigger and you don't end up having to, because once I've started telling you the story, it's only respectful that you hear it, but you don't have the time. There are 17 other people waiting to talk to you, right? So how do we move the conversation? How do I give you space that's impacted? What am I going to do with that? And how do I put that in policy? That's a response. Like, how do we even do the work? And finally, resist re-traumatizing. This is where some of the practice comes in, right? Someone's about to tell you a story. They're telling you a story. You're going to ask for more information. That's the natural thing. Wait, so then what happened? And then what happened, or however the conversation might go. Well, guess what? Now the person's or you don't even realize that I might have just been re-triggered. I'll give you an example. I'm in a jurisdiction under a consent decree, and my focus is on community, and someone asks if I would be willing to speak to a woman who had an incident, a really bad interaction. I should hear about it. They're under consent. You need to go and tell the DOJ. I was like, all right, let me call her up. So I called her up. Great conversation. Horrible story. Jailed, IV, hospitalized, pulled off hospital beds, all the things. I'm just listening. And I checked if she was okay after the call. And she said yes. And then I get a very frantic call 2 days later that the person is feeling suicidal and she's been re-triggered. I didn't set up. I'm panicking. I'm not anywhere near this jurisdiction anymore. I had this phone call. It was a phone call. In my mind, we're just chatting. She asked to speak to me. She thinks I can help. And now I'm panicked. I've done that thing. I've just re-traumatized her. She's telling me that I've re-traumatized her. So now I take it upon myself to try and find services to help her. How I would have done it differently, because I didn't know, we were talking on the phone, she seemed fine. I don't know. I think I might have asked if she was okay sharing. She was definitely scared that now that she told me there'd be retaliation, and so there was a lot of calming. I don't know that I could have done it differently. I probably could have. Maybe I could have asked to speak to her in person. I don't know. Well, let me ask you. Could I have done it differently? There's no right and wrong. We're really just chatting, because there's not going to be a right and wrong when you do it. You're humans talking to humans. What could I have done differently? I think met her in person.
Or at least video conference, at least instead of just a voice, actually being able to see face to face.
Yeah.
Get a little layer of expression and seeing what that would look like.
I could have scheduled it for when I was there. Because if it's that important,
Yeah, or even sometimes I think voice.
Yeah.
Where I can't see you and
Yeah.
I can't see the seriousness on your face or the expression.
yeah,
Maybe a Zoom or a video call as opposed to
a phone
a
call.
phone call.
Maybe.
Where she can see the earnestness, at least of your face, maybe not
Yeah.
your body language, but that you're really listening.
Yeah.
You may be able to see her getting upset, even though might not be coming across in her voice.
Yeah.
So you might have the opportunity to cut it off sooner. Maybe if I can hear it in your voice, I can find out a little bit about what you're upset about, because you're finding out days later or a week later
Yeah.
what that was. If you can see it coming, you might be able to say, oh, well, retaliation isn't a concern here because this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
So there might have been an opportunity to reassure.
Yeah.
Before it became a reaction.
Commissioner Sykes.
The thought that came to my mind is I would have asked her, what's your preference in terms of meeting
Yeah.
at the beginning, in person, on the phone, and then you probably could have gauged better the best way to deal with it.
Yeah. So many different ways. I don't know. I am especially sensitive to trauma, so I definitely stayed in contact with her. Another thing I could have done is had a phone number in my back pocket. Hey, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to share this phone number with you. I'm going to text it to you. If you feel any kind of way, you're always welcome to call me back or call the hotline. Because now I've inserted myself. Now I'm the story. And that's, I mean, even from my journalism days, bad news bears. And God forbid, should she have done anything, I don't know what that would have done to our work. That's not why I was there. So I might have also just overstepped by even accepting the story. I don't know. Commissioner Roy, were you going to say something?
It was actually similar to what you said, but maybe I know that being alone after something like that can be
Yeah.
difficult for a lot of people. So maybe if there was a trusted, neutral third party that could be, around when you're having the conversation,
Yeah.
if you can't be there, to maybe reassure that person afterwards. You can start kind of spinning a story in your head with trauma, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
having somebody else to bounce that off might have helped
Yeah.
that person. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just all to show you like the complexity of it. And again, the level of humanity that you want to show, and just be, if you're not ready to keep showing up or serve as kind of, and I don't want you to serve as social workers because we're not accredited to be social workers. But just be mindful when you put yourself out there, what that means, who you're holding, right? If someone cries in front of you, what are you going to do? You get to decide whether you feel comfortable to touch. Ask, can I hold your hand? Are you okay? I wish I'd asked her in the beginning, if she felt comfortable, what she expected me to do. Her story happened over 10 years ago. way out of statute of limitations. Nothing can be done, which is what I tried to reassure her when she was nervous about the retaliation. And then that might have undercut my credibility. So why am I even talking to you if you're not going to help? But then I would have explained to her, your story's out of statute. Here's what we can do. Here's trauma healing. That's if I was really in that space. But just to share with you, like, careful the amount you go in, right? Because when you're in, you are kind of responsible in a way.
So hard to get out.
Yes, it is. Okay. I've put down here, especially around resisting re-traumatization, because you might get it. You might get public comment. You really want to find out more about the story so that you can find out if there's anything. So you might want to go after the meeting and speak to some, double check, go slow, ask gently. Can I talk to you right now? You see, it seems like you're heated. Perhaps you'd like to talk to me another time. You don't want to talk to me. Please feel free to go to any other commissioner, right? Maybe I don't want to speak to Commissioner Roy because he's a man and I've got an issue with men. I might come to one of the female or female presenting commissioners. Okay. Thank you. Moving on from that. So you've got four R's of trauma-informed practice and 6 principles that I think Manny's going to show us in just a second. Manny, can you show us the next slide, please? Thank you. The 6 principles, also from the same agency, SAMSHA. I should have found out if it's a word or not. Foundational. These, SAMSA, we're going to take these 2 at a time, and I've made these specific for oversight. So sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. Like the peer support, I thought was a little bit loose, but all to say, again, just be mindful. All of these are just come back to procedural. It comes back to every one of the trainings that we've done in some capacity, right? It's just always about awareness. So safety, transparency and trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, historical and gender responsiveness. Okay, let's take the first 2, please. Next slide, please, Manny. Manny. All right. Safety and trustworthiness. So we talked about safety extensively. Commissioner Yoon, you pointed out safety is a first call, physically, emotionally, and culturally. I know this is going to sound contradictory because in another episode that we did together, I asked you to check your own personal biases and your baggage. This time I'm asking you to kind of come forward with it, right? So if I see faces that look like mine, it helps. If I start hearing stories that resonate with mine, it helps. You know what? I've been there too. I have not also been attacked, Commissioner Highballs, but that's another way. I understand. Oh, I know that neighborhood. Yeah. You don't need to fake it. Don't fake it. Be authentic. If you don't have that story, that's not yours then. But by sharing or by showing that there's resonance, you're reminding me of your humanity and reminding me that like, okay, all right, this wasn't, I am reminded that I need to be present and embodied because I'm safe. So in oversight, setting clear expectations and ground rules, creating options for people to pause, opt out, or ask questions, being mindful of tone, body language, and power dynamics. If you can see, and I didn't want to get, again, I don't want to get too much into it. At one point I asked Ms. Neb if I can bring videos, and I think you looked a little horrified. I don't want us to get into like, oh, so-and-so is fidgeting. I don't know. But I think you can tell. I think in your lives, you would have seen someone that shows agitation. Or again, be mindful, flight, fright, freeze, fawn. It shows up in different ways. But I think you can tell the obvious ones, right? So, all right, you know what? I feel like you're getting worked up. Are you okay? Let's take a break. I really need to hear your evidence. Maybe you can write it in. Does that feel comfortable? Do you want to tell me at a different time? Do you want to call me? Again, maybe you want to do it 2 at a time so that you don't ever be in a position where there's only one of you that's kind of, Commissioner Sykes, did you want to chime in?
I was focusing on under the 3rd bullet point where it
Yeah.
says power dynamics. So
Oh.
I was trying to, I think I know what it may be, but I just
Oh.
want to say,
Tell me what you think.
power dynamics is, I'm thinking of the word control, where there's a power struggle between the person speaking and yourself as your position as a commissioner.
Yeah.
So you want to avoid trying to project that to the person that's speaking. That's how I'm thinking of power dynamics. It may mean something.
And you're spot on.
Okay.
Assume that this is the hall that you'll be having your meetings. I'm in your house. So there are times where I need you to exercise your authority and your power, and you just stop talking. You've got 2-minute public right, but I also need you to check your power. So if this is going to be not even tense, if it's ever so slightly delicate, you might want to, let's go back to the East Coast rather than give you random examples. East Coast, right? They were having the results of this investigation. They knew it was going to be, we talked about this together, how they're going to sit, right? It's a predominantly African-American board in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, or that's the community that they have been looking after. That's who's been most impacted or harmed. By being on a dais, I'm crying, you're watching me. That feels some kind of way, right? If you are bored, you're on your phones, which is going to be tempting. I'm not going to lie. I've done it myself. Right? But that's a power dynamic. Suddenly you're not really listening to my story, or I don't think perception is reality. Procedural justice. You might be doing everything by the book. If I don't feel it, it's not just. You can only do the best that you can do. But absolutely, that's a power dynamic. So some things are going to be unavoidable. You have to sit up here so that we can hear you, and right. If it's a particularly tense, say you have one of those investigations and you're giving us the results for it, so you're still going to be there, but you might say like, look, we'll come into your community, or you might finish, or even before the meeting or after the meeting, just walk through, check on people. If you feel safe, you too are traumatized. You too will be. You'll be hearing stories. You got to be able to get some distance between you and that. So yes, absolutely. That's what I meant by power dynamics. Oh, that's yes. Trustworthiness and transparency. Again, we've talked about this extensively. The transparency part, I want to be very mindful. There's some things you can't talk about. Please don't forget that. But as soon as you're able to do, you also have the responsibility to tell me why you can't tell me. Tell me about the laws. But why this matters when it comes to trauma. If I know what's about to happen, there are no surprises, I can let my guard down. If you're about to surprise me with something, immediately my guard comes up. Wait, what? Who's just come in, right? If you told me that this was a safe space and there are going to be no officers in uniform, and then all of a sudden I see 10 squad cars, I'm probably not coming in. So that's up to you. Maybe you don't want me in. But you got to be mindful about what you're about to set up. Same with the expectations, especially if you're about to open up things like policies. We can't change it. We can offer recommendations or whatever your mandate allows. Be really forthcoming. Wait, did you, and let me reiterate, this isn't a fix. This is a blah, 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 blah. People are coming to you, expecting you, both sides, from the officer's side as well as the community side. You've got both sides looking at you to help. But if you can be very plain spoken, matter of fact about what you're able to do, what this session is about. This session is about making sure we hear your concerns. I told you what the session is about.
I think it's also important to remember when you're managing those expectations that your information needs to be correct. Because if you guess and you tell that to that community member or to a series of community members in the room, and it turns out you're wrong. Oh, well, you'll hear all about that at the end of X. I'll be able to tell you that in July, but I can't tell you in May because it's still going on, or whatever those things are. Be sure at that point that you're right before you make a promise that as an organization we can't keep. Nothing erodes trust faster. Nothing traumatizes people more than thinking they're going to know something or thinking a specific outcome is going to happen and it doesn't. And so I think it's important that if you're ever in doubt, ask. That your assigned staff person, your assigned attorney, etc., will be able to help you to know, well, no, that's likely to never happen because of X, but this can happen. And so that when you tell them, well, that won't happen, but this will, then you'll be right. And you'll not only manage that expectation, but they won't feel traumatized and dishonored when the reality doesn't meet that expectation or what they expected, what they expected from you, because maybe there was a misspeak. So I think that's important.
Thank you for that. I've put avoid, oh, go ahead, Commissioner Sykes.
So I have a question that needs clarification.
Tell me.
It's the first sentence says people know what's coming and understand how decisions are made.
Yep. That's okay.
That I see, my mind is not grasping that very well because what I'm seeing is that sometimes people do not understand how decisions are made. They have one idea of how it should be, but in reality, it's different. So that's where my mind is not wrapping around people understand how decisions are made. Because a lot of time you have to stop and kind of educate people
Absolutely.
on how things are done. So to say they understand is, I don't know, it's a better word, or hopefully try and understand. Because if you tell people what the policy is on something they don't like, they'll tell you in a minute, I don't understand it. So I'm just,
I love a live edit. Okay, how about people know what's coming and are aware of how decisions are made?
I still have a challenge with that one.
Also, I'm going to push back on this
Or
challenge.
made aware of how decisions.
Sure, sure. Because you do, first off, again, in the process or in the spirit of transparency, and I'm only picking up on semantics, you said we have to stop. You shouldn't be stopping. You tell me at the front, you tell me at the end, right? I told you. The reason I'm not going to be able to go into this, we just came out of closed session, nothing to report on closed session. Wait, what do you mean? You were in there for 45 minutes. Don't let me ask you, don't have me. The reason every time, the reason we can't report on closed session, we covered the reason that you can't report on closed session. That you'll be counseled by your counsel. And explain it to people. You also have a responsibility to help educate the rest of us on the legalities. This stuff is boring. I don't care. I only care when I'm impacted. Me personally, I'm speaking from the eye. But that tends to be how all of us move. I don't really want to have to watch C-SPAN. But I'd really like a truncated version of closed session, of Brown Act, so I hear you and you're right. My understanding is subjective. You only have to tell me and then put it up somewhere so that in case I keep going back and reminding me. Does that at least reconcile?
That's better. Thank
Okay.
you.
Think of it like a little bit when I'm trying to explain it to somebody. I can't tell you because. And I think they may not like it. They may not accept it, because acceptance is something different. But at least they will possess the knowledge that you have told them, thank you for asking me about X. I cannot respond and tell you about X because of, and then fill in that blank.
So how about saying, allow me to explain to you why we cannot disclose the information you're seeking?
Great segue. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. I don't think it matters how you introduce it. It's not leaving it hang there.
Yeah, because
One of my hard-earned lessons, by the way,
I think one of the things I'm thinking of is sometimes when you say because, that triggers people.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. That's good information.
Yeah, it triggers people. They believe you're trying to hide something. So you just want to say, let me explain why.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more of a acceptable response.
Thank you. That's great.
I want to touch on the jargon bit a little bit. And this goes maybe a little bit to the power dynamics. When you use jargon that is very familiar to you all and not to the rest of us, it feels like I'm stupid, or it can feel condescending. And so as much as possible, we try and just use layman's language, human terms. If I have to use a legal theory or definition or something, I always try and explain it. I do the same when it comes to policy. I am not a policy writer, so and I think I've mentioned to you, even I struggle sometimes with policy. There's a big difference between should and shall. Not in the, not in fiction, there isn't. But it means different things. So that jargon is another way that your power comes through. So you absolutely say code the bill that says this, right? We've read it out. That means I understand that to me, right? That's why we do definitions. I just wanted to point that out because power is a big deal when it comes to your work and when it comes to this topic. Moving on. Next slide, please, Manny. The two we're covering here are peer support and collaboration. People feel supported by others and who've been through the same experience. So if it feels comfortable, I'm aware of that. I know that neighborhood. That's happened to me. If, again, depending on the situation, you're not necessarily going to do that in public comment. You might not also want to do that in the listening session. But it's one of the reasons also that you want a diverse commission as you have, right? So that folks can see themselves in any one of you or any part of one of you. And in oversight, that means validating lived experiences and not saying like, well, I don't believe that happened. Not on that strip, not with that, well, hang on. Yeah. No, I could see that as plausible. Or the lights on that street are particularly, again, you're humanizing it. You're not necessarily validating them, but you're making it safe to kind of like keep talking, keep sharing as much as they feel comfortable. Recognizing that showing up is an act of bravery. That public comment is really scary. Being in front of you is really scary. Like, and I've met you now a couple of times, and this is still nerve-wracking. I'm still talking to you, and I don't want to misspeak. I'm not trying to offend, all of the things, right? And I'm also trying to remember all the things I want to impart. Drawing on shared knowledge of other impacted communities. It's why we covered some stuff like the history or the generational. You don't need to come out and say it. You don't know who is, say, African American or an African migrant. Now, there's we want to be very careful about the nuances. You don't want to fall into stereotypes and bias and discrimination, all that good stuff. But just being aware, for example, that for some, just the very presence of a police officer means something, good or bad. I think I've shared with you, there are some communities that I've been in, especially in migrant communities, interestingly enough, and I've been researching and tracking that. I looked after Dearborn for a little bit. So heavy Arab community, heavy Muslim community, heavy migrant community. They really like seeing police officers in uniform. The authority, right? Now you've got other issues that come with that, but domestic violence becomes really hard to report because you're a police officer. Corruption, bribery is a little easier because back in my country, all right, what do you mean? I'm your neighbor. I know you aren't. Just overlook that, right? So we've got other issues happening. Collaboration and mutuality. That collaboration portion, can I do any of this work with community? Don't just tell me you've looked at the canine policy and here are 3 recommendations. Can you ask me? Did you ask anyone? Did you ask me? I mean, you can be that kind of commission if you want. I would advise that you find ways of making this collaborative. And that also means maybe bringing in, again, we talked about, do I have listening sessions? Do I do working groups and work on policies with union reps? That's going to be I don't know how you do that. You're going to have to figure out whether or not you want to try it. You get to pilot. We get to be transparent. I'm inviting so-and-so if you feel, but also if I'm with impacted communities, is that really the room I want to set up? Or do I want to go and hear here and go and hear here? I've got a transparency responsibility. I'm going to bring it back to this meeting and share what I heard from both groups, right? Don't hoard the information. Information is power. You want to be responsible with yours. Does that make sense? Do you see how we've created a safe space, but still doing the things? We're still talking to all the stakeholders. Can you see what happens if I leave out the police when I'm working on policy? I'm not going to get their buy-in. They're not going to take my recommendations. But if I do have someone there, or maybe it's a lawyer, or maybe I'm asking questions like, what happens if we go heavy on de-escalation? Well, as an officer, I'm scared. Hear the stories. Try and do the reconciliation. Be mindful about the story, the space that you set up, so that the officer too feels comfortable enough to talk to you. Don't put me in with a crowd of angry. I don't want that. That's not helpful. You're traumatizing me, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Acknowledging what you don't know. That's really interesting. I'll get back to you. I don't know. I read this article. Okay, thanks. Can you share the article with me? I'll get back to you. It's so much easier than making a mistake. And also, if you've made a mistake, we made a mistake, folks. I'm so sorry. We had in Oakland, we accidentally violated the Brown Act when we were doing interviews for an executive of where the commission was trying to hire the head of one of the oversight agencies. I think it was the IG's office or something. I missed the 72-hour. I didn't, because it was a special meeting. So in my mind, it's a special meeting. I don't have to do Brown Act in the same way. I had to fall on my sword. I'm so sorry. I was in violation of the Brown Act. I had a statement that I gave at the next commission. I don't want to be in violation either. So it's important that I, as the staff person, but also as commissioners, like, okay, I need you to let me do this, or you need to do it. Because otherwise we start if I'm the staff person, I'm as good as one of you lot. Not in the power, but the community will associate me for working with you, obviously. Anything else there? Oh yeah, framing your role as an expert, not as an expert, sorry. Don't be an expert unless you are an expert. You're a partner. You are volunteers. We've talked about that funny, you have power, you're political, but you're not political, you tread a fine line. Any questions, any issues, any concerns? Okay. For me, this smacks so much of procedural justice stuff. I don't know if it feels the same for you. Next slide, please, Manny. These are the last two. Empowerment and that very long cultural, historical, gender awareness, all the things. Let's go with empowerment first. By giving me the mic, by doing public comment, you are empowering your community. You are giving voice. You might be there till midnight. It might be very painful. You might have to take breaks. You get to. But if you've opened up and honored a public, I'm just, again, an example, a public comment, do the public comment. We're there till midnight, that procedural justice. I think it was you, Commissioner Yoon, when we were talking about like, how long would you have it? Folks, I see that we've got at least 70 people in this room and a really heavy agenda. We're going to knock down public comment to 2 minutes tonight, not from the usual 3. We're going to knock it down to 1. I'm so sorry. We just want to make sure that we get through everyone's voice. Okay. And again, people might not feel comfortable coming up to you, to the dais, so make sure that they know, according to the Brown Act, you can submit public comment online, so I can email you and you have to read it out or acknowledge that you had public comment received. The cultural, historic, and gender responsiveness. Again, trauma's in my body, so I might feel like I have been targeted in some way. So just being able to kind of like recognizing is really, there are moments where you might need to say it out loud. I'm trying to think of an example where we in San Francisco, it was collaborative reform, but the Department of Justice strongly suggested that the police department, after an officer-involved shooting, held a town hall within 24 hours to give out information, right? So the commission was also there. So there would be historic neighborhoods or neighborhoods that we knew about, and being open about why we chose that venue. Again, the commissioners were able to do it, so the police didn't have to. So it didn't come across as like it felt authentic. And it was the commission that suggested, like you do it in a library, for example. Just recognizing what the community might be going through, starting off statements with, this might be difficult, we're in this together, however you want to frame that. Also being mindful, again, we talked a little bit about that bias, about joking, about being on the dais, right? Some folks might look funny to you. Some folks might look, however, you check yourself, stone-faced as much as possible, because I need you to be, I can't Don't show me, you can't be like totally an open book, but I need you to hold and hear in the same way for everyone so that you're not creating a discrimination where you didn't intend to. Adjusting your tone and process and expectations. You might want to slow down. You might want to, right? Because I might be in communities where English is not the first language, perhaps. I might want to slow down because, again, this is going to be an agitated evening. So I'm going to be calm in how I talk so that I don't start riling people up. I might ask if you're, that all of this, just how we kind of look after each other and the nuance of being in a marginalized and disenfranchised community. So if there are, the districts in San Francisco, the district stations would hold monthly meetings. I was able to attend one in the Tenderloin, and it was predominantly a Yemeni community group that showed up. And so I had to remind some of the folks in that room cultural nuance. As a man to a woman, maybe don't offer your hand out, you put your hand on, all that cultural stuff that, again, you might know, you might not know. If someone's in the room, hey, by the way, if you offer your hand and they don't shake your hand back, it's not rude. That's just the culture. So we do, that I know my culture, I don't know other people. So just being mindful of, again, where we are. Do I need to know? What community am I coming into? Is there a nuance that I should be mindful of? Okay. Any thoughts on that? Thank you. Next slide, please, Manny. Talked about power a lot. I want to talk to you about the well-intentioned bit, because you're always going to be well-intentioned, I assume, I hope. That's where some of the biggest mistakes are, right? I thought I was doing a nice thing, a good thing, by hearing this person out on the phone, and I actually caused more damage. Totally well-intentioned. I kept asking her to carry on, even as her story was getting more and more tragic. And maybe what I should have done is, are you okay talking to me about this? Is someone in your home with you? However that might be. Again, hindsight, I had no idea. I don't know that I'd do it again. I hope I'd remember. People might not distinguish between oversight and enforcement, especially if you have, well, generally in your jobs, right? Are you now the man? Are you now the system? I might rail against you because your supervisor picked you, the mayor picked you. I don't know who, however you came on here. But also, so some of the commissions, San Francisco, the chief was always invited and had a seat on the dais and had a name plaque. Oakland, invitation only. The chief was not expected to show up all the time. So that, again, perception is reality. Are you them? Are you me? What? You just need to be forthright with how you see yourself and who you are, and that we are balanced and we are neutral. And this is what we look after. You don't need to try and play both sides or play either sides, but just be mindful, right? That, again, when people come to you, you are either, you're my last shot maybe, but you also are talking to them. You have closed sessions. You're part of the system now. And that last one, I'm hoping that you're able to not cause more harm, if nothing else. Next slide, please, Manny. This one's going to be controversial, but yeah, officers carry trauma too. And you need to be aware of it, and you need to be mindful of it. And I really like the President's Task Force 21st Century Policing. I think I've used it for every single one of I use it all the time, and I use it because Pillar 6 is all about officer morale and officer safety and officer well-being. If hurt people, if the officer is traumatized and unhealed, guess what? Some of that same stuff that we're talking about, is that belligerence, is that non-compliance? Well, guess what? It comes out in an officer as well, right? Are they particularly aggressive? These folks, I'm not here to defend officers. I'm not here to defend anyone or to advocate for anyone, but I am going to remind you that they too are people, and they get to see some of the worst of our society. And some of the most tragic, some of the hardest, and so I would always, our police departments don't do, I believe, and again, this is my belief, I don't think we do a good enough job in officer wellness, on forcing officers to look after themselves or looking after them, or whatever that means. And I feel like we should be doing better. So the President's Task Force, that Pillar 6 is entirely about this section. or trauma in officers and how the expectation for the Department of Justice strongly recommending that police departments do something, whether that's coaching, is that partnering, do you have a buddy system, do you go to a counselor, is it forced, do you do psych evaluations every year, because maybe you don't feel like you're traumatized. But I just wanted to point this out so that, again, you have that balance and that neutrality as you're reading, as you're listening to people, as you're going through your work. I think that's it. Oh, and then resources. Can I, next slide, please, Manny. I really enjoyed finding some of these. Some, as I'd mentioned, I'd used before. There are two that I'm going to point out that were, that I think are quite exceptional. My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Manakim. Phenomenal. It's a book. It's a book that he's on YouTube. I think I found a video both for Commissioner Roy and Commissioner Jones. I liked the challenge of finding accessible, non-ready things. Really good. One of the reasons I find it really good is that he offers difficult to read. It was difficult for me to read, but after every chapter, he offers exercises and mediations for cops, right? Blue bodies, I think he calls them at some point, and then for traumatized communities. Trauma also shows up, by the way, and sorry to kind of bring this up now, but I'm just reminded by it. This is where it might start frustrating you, that we had in every jurisdiction I've been in, there's always someone that comes back and gives public comment every single time about the same issue. And it's really hard. In San Francisco, there was a young woman, or maybe she wasn't young, there was a woman who lost her son to gang violence. She kept giving public comment because she felt that the cops weren't doing enough to try and solve the case. So this wasn't a bad interaction. This was something slightly different. Every single meeting. And several times commissioners tried to speak to her privately by telling her that there's really nothing that they could do, or again, making her aware, explaining the process. She just needed to come up. That's her trauma. She just needs to come and voice it. We weren't able to offer her or get her into services. Maybe she had taken them herself, but that's some of the ways that it's going to show up and might irritate you. Oh, here's so-and-so again, going on about that thing again that we can't do anything about. It's okay. Let it be. That's them. But I'm just reminded because those exercises, again, work with community and work with police officers. The other one that I really enjoyed, if you want to do more, was the online toolkit. Oh, it's a little jagged. Sorry, I didn't realize the formatting. Comes from Oregon. I think it's Oregon State government. Online courses, a few minutes for a video. It's free. Again, you're not credentialed. On the off chance, I didn't go into like trauma's effect on the body and trauma's effect on the brain. I don't know that we need to get into all that science. But those are two that I really appreciated and wanted to kind of point out. Thank you so much for having me for this and all the others. I'm really excited for you and so grateful to have been part of your journey. Thank you. I know.
Okay, so begin the mic for this. So thank you, Rania, for
Pleasure.
joining us for all of the modules that you did.
Thanks.
And we've learned a lot from you and we've had a good time while doing it. So that's good.
Thank you.
We are going to take a recess. Our next presenter is Lisa Lee, and she will be speaking to you on the next topics, but she will be online. And ironically, she's at a hearing, I guess. She was at a deposition. Okay. So she is an attorney, by the way. We are going to have her start after we put some food into people. So we did get some sandwiches and chips and drinks tonight, and they are on the back table, and they're all marked in theory. And I hope we manage to get something that anybody or everybody gets something they want. So we just kind of guessed. So we'll take a break, probably, it's 7:20. Why don't we take a 15, 20-minute break and come back? You stick around, but you're encouraged to, and we even got food for you too.
So kind.
Yeah. We okay to start? Okay. So it'll be a minute while we get in touch with Lisa. So um Manny, are we back on?
Thank you. Yes, we are on, and I'm currently working on getting Lisa promoted to panelist.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let us know.
Okay, she's in.
Hello, everyone.
So I don't know because now we have to turn around and look at her backwards. But so like to welcome Lisa Lee, who is a partner with Burke Williams and Sorensen, who will be presenting your, believe it or not, final of your initial trainings this evening. And I'm gonna let Lisa introduce herself and then move into her module here. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Lee. I am a partner with the law firm Berg Williams and Sorensen. My firm represents public entities throughout the state of California. My office is in Los Angeles. However, we have offices in Northern California, including San Francisco, Oakland, and other areas. And my main practice at Burke Williams and Sorensen is police litigation, constitutional law. I defend public entities, including police officers, in lawsuits that citizens file, mainly based on excessive force, wrongful search and seizure, and other constitutional claims. I also advise police and city agencies regarding use of force policies, internal affairs investigations policies, and general police practice. I've been an attorney for over 27 years. I started out my law career as a deputy district attorney in Ventura County, as well as Maui, Hawaii. I did that for about 9 years. I was a sex crimes prosecutor for 7 years, homicide prosecutor, and also in my brief stint in Hawaii, I reviewed officer uses of force for potential criminal prosecution. After that, I was in the private sector doing business and corporate law for about 7 years. And then I decided to go back to representing public entities. And so I was a deputy city attorney within the city of Los Angeles for a little bit over 7 years, where I regularly represented police officers and the city of Los Angeles in litigation matters. I also presented to the city council in Los Angeles and also represented members of the Board of Police Commissioners in Los Angeles, which is also a civilian oversight committee that reviews police interactions with citizens. So it's a pleasure to meet with you all, and I hope that I can give you some helpful information regarding constitutional rights and police interactions with citizens. I have some slides I've presented, and I'm going to go through those slides that basically go over the Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights, constitutional rights. And then at the end, I have reserved some time for questions. So I will begin with the second slide, please. Thank you. So the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, which means that the police must have legal justification to stop, detain, or search citizens. The Fourth Amendment balances law enforcement authority, which is critical to society, with individual privacy rights. And the right to privacy is stated in the California Constitution as well under Article 1, Section 1, and it's the right to privacy for individuals. Okay, next slide. So regarding citizen interactions with police officers, they have to have either reasonable suspicion to stop and frisk a person or probable cause to search or arrest a person. So reasonable suspicion has been defined by the courts as a set of facts leading a reasonable officer to suspect a crime. It's less than probable cause, and this is the standard that's used to determine police officers' stop and frisk. And generally, these will be contacts where, say, for instance, a police officer wants to contact a citizen on the streets or outside of their homes, or very common in traffic stops. So once again, officers have to have a reasonable suspicion to make what they call a stop and frisk. Next slide, please. So the stop and frisk has been defined under a case called Terry versus Ohio, which basically says that officers may stop and frisk when they have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. So reasonable suspicion has been defined as, or is defined as, a reasonable suspicion that the suspect has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. The stop it's a brief investigative detention, and the frisk is a pat down for weapons. So basically what this means is that police officers have to be able to articulate a reasonable suspicion before they can stop and frisk a citizen. And this reasonable suspicion, if it's articulated properly, this alone is what permits officers to stop and frisk citizens. And the detention must be brief and reasonable within the time constraints and totality of the circumstances. And once again, police can make these contacts if they have a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity and a reasonable belief that the person may be armed. That's for the frisk. So as an example, during what they call a Terry stop, police can conduct a pat-down search, which is what they call the frisk, to look for weapons, but only if they have a justifiable belief that the suspect is armed and dangerous. During the frisk, the officer can pat down only the outer clothing. They cannot reach under clothing or in pockets unless they plainly feel a weapon or contraband. And a lot of racial profiling concerns have led some California cities to ban or restrict this practice. But under the US Constitution and California law, a stop and frisk is permitted. Okay, next slide. So what are factors that officers can consider to determine reasonable suspicion? So the courts have stated that these are some factors that can be considered, but there's no list that officers have to, there's no checklist that officers have to check. Basically, these are just factors that the courts say that can be considered. So if the person being stopped matches the description of a suspect in a crime, that's a factor that can be considered. Furtive behavior is another factor that can be considered. So as an example of during a stop, a citizen, makes a reach within their pants or within their shirt, or if it's a stop within the car, they reach, within the center console or in another part of the car where the police may believe that it's suspicious. There could be hiding a weapon or hiding contraband. Then that's a factor that can be considered by police that would amount to reasonable suspicion. Another factor is the location where the crime occurred. So if the individual is within the location that police believe the crime occurred, once again, that's a factor. Any type of unusual activity, given the circumstances, can be considered. And if the police witness or have information of exchange of money or goods that can be considered in the totality of the circumstances. Let me see. Everything is really a case by case analysis. So once again, there's not a checklist that's required before police can develop a reasonable suspicion. The only thing that police officers need to do is they need to be able to articulate specific facts to justify the reasonable suspicion. I'll give you an example of a prior police litigation case I had that kind of demonstrates some of the factors that police officers consider. So in one of my prior cases, it was a lawsuit against police officers and the city for the alleged improper Fourth Amendment violation of both the stop and the subsequent search of the individual. So in that case, officers received a bulletin regarding an outstanding robbery suspect who was armed with a handgun. And while officers were driving in their car, they saw the plaintiff, who matched the general description of the suspect. So the general description was white male, 20s to 30s, bald, 5'9", medium build. And they saw the suspect in the general location where the robbery occurred the night before. And the suspect was standing on a street corner and speaking with another person. And so officers pulled out a photo of the actual suspect that was on the bulletin that they reviewed during their roll call. They pulled it up on their cell phone and they drove close, within about 30 feet away. And they looked at the photo and they looked at the individual and they believed that it was a match. They believed it was the same person. And so when the plaintiff saw the police looking at him, he made a furtive movement, meaning he took his hands and he put them in his jacket pocket, and he looked very nervous as if he was going to flee. Officers believe that the plaintiff could have been reaching for a weapon because the outstanding suspect in the robbery was noted to have a handgun. And the police exited their vehicle and they immediately went to detain the plaintiff and secure his hands while they could question him. Officers detained the suspect, handcuffed him. They placed him in their police car, rolled up his sleeves to check for tattoos, because on the bulletin regarding this robbery suspect, that suspect had tattoos covering both of his arms. When the officers rolled up the suspect's arms, the sleeves to his arms, they noticed that no tattoos were found, and so they released the suspect. Now, that individual later on sued the police officers for a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights for stop and detention. We brought a motion for summary judgment, which is asking the court to find that, even assuming that everything that the plaintiff says is true, that there were no sufficient facts for the claim to go forward. And the court found that the officers articulated sufficient facts to justify the stop and the detention. There is a case called People versus Flores that did emphasize, though, that simply being in a high crime area or appearing nervous when confronted by police does not automatically create reasonable suspicion. And the California Supreme Court ruled that such factors on their own are not sufficient to justify a detention. But once again, the totality of the circumstances for each contact have to be considered. And if the officers are able to articulate factors that are sufficient for reasonable suspicion, then that would be a lawful contact. Okay, next slide, please. So citizens' rights generally during a stop when they are stopped by police. So in California, citizens are not obligated to identify themselves unless they are detained or arrested. So in other words, if a citizen is just walking down the street and a police officer says, "I want to see your ID," the citizen is not obligated to show the ID. However, during a detention, the citizen is obligated to show their identification. So as an example, citizens must present their driver's license during a traffic stop. Citizens can also record their encounters with police officers. Everybody has a cell phone now and always, has their cell phone out recording. So there's no law that prohibits citizens from recording their encounters with police officers. However, there are limitations to this. Police may not, the limitations are that citizens cannot interfere with a police officer's duties. There's a Penal Code section 148 in California, which makes it a crime. It's a misdemeanor to willfully resist, delay, or obstruct a peace officer in the performance of that officer's duties. So for example, if during a stop or a detention, a citizen records the police officer in a manner that obstructs the police officer's performance of their duties, then that citizen can be in violation of Penal Code Section 148. Many times we see during stops that, citizens will confront officers by sticking a phone in their face or call other people to film the officers. They'll ignore the officer's commands. Once again, if the officers can articulate that the citizen in recording them or, putting a phone in their face, if that obstructs the officer's performance of their duties, then that can be a violation of Penal Code Section 148. Police work, by its very nature, is very reactionary, meaning if citizens comply with police officers, there's really never a need for a use of force. I have never, in close to 20 years of working with police officers, ever seen a use of force when citizens simply follow orders. If citizens follow orders, there's no need for a use of force. The suggestion is always that, people should provide information requested. If the officer says step out of the car, then step out of the car. Do not resist. And, if citizens believe that the command is unlawful, they should comply at the time, file a complaint later, maybe file a lawsuit later, but confronting officers, refusing to obey commands will likely result in an escalation of the incident and perhaps a use of force, and in any event, subject them to potential criminal prosecution under Penal Code Section 148. So what can citizens ask police officers when they are stopped? They can ask police officers, am I free to leave? Am I being detained? And if they're informed that they are being detained, then they must present their driver's license. They must cooperate with the police officer's investigation. Police may not seize or search a citizen's cell phone based on reasonable suspicion alone, but they can if the officers can articulate probable cause to believe that a crime, that the phone contains evidence of a crime. If the court finds that a subsequent stop and frisk was not constitutional, it can constitute a civil rights violation, which can subject the police officer and the city to a Section 1983 lawsuit. It's a federal lawsuit. I'll go over that in a little more detail later. And also, if the court subsequently finds the stop and frisk was not constitutional, then any evidence found would be subject to the exclusionary rule in criminal court, meaning that police officers could not use any evidence that was the subject of a Fourth Amendment violation against the individual in criminal court. So once again, under Penal Code Section 148, it is a crime for citizens to resist, delay, or obstruct a peace officer in the performance of their duties, and citizens must comply with lawful commands. Okay, next slide, please. Fourth Amendment search and seizure. So this would be a search and seizure, which is beyond what we talked about, the Terry stop and frisk. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. A search is a governmental intrusion into a citizen's privacy, and a seizure is taking property or detaining someone. And pursuant to the Fourth Amendment, generally warrants are needed. So police have to get a warrant to either search or seize a person. That's the general rule. However, there are exceptions. Next slide, please. Generally, what the warrant requirement is that the Fourth Amendment requires law enforcement to obtain a warrant before conducting a search or a seizure. The warrant has to be based on probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation. So that would be an attestation from the police officers that they believe that the place to be searched and the items to be seized, it has to articulate that. And once again, there are exceptions such as search incident to lawful arrest or exigent circumstances. And I'll go over those next. Okay, next slide. So when can the police conduct a search without a warrant? These are the exceptions, and consent, plain view, incident to arrest, exigent circumstances, and vehicle searches. Absent an exception, then citizens can refuse if there's no warrant and no exception that applies. Next slide, please. Okay, consent. Consent is when a person voluntarily gives permission for law enforcement to search them, their belongings, or their property. Consent has to be free and voluntary and not coerced. Consent has to be given by persons who have the authority to give consent. So generally, for example, roommates can consent to shared living quarters, excuse me, but not to a bedroom unless that roommate has access to that bedroom. Consent comes up on probation consent searches. And what this is that when a citizen is convicted of a crime and the court imposes a sentence, then the court can suspend the actual jail sentence and instead place the offender on supervised release. As part of that supervised release, that the person consents to certain conditions, and that can community service, counseling, whatever the court deems appropriate given the crime and the circumstances. But generally, for all persons that are on probation and parole, they are agreeing when they accept that probation to consent to search. That's generally a term for individuals who are on probation. So what that means is that that person is consenting or allowing police officers or probation officers to search their person and their property, including their personal property, residence, their vehicle, without a warrant, even if there's officers are not able to articulate reasonable suspicion or probable cause. It's generally any time that the officers are aware and have confirmed that the person has what they call search terms, it's considered consent. And so when a citizen agrees to be placed on probation with search terms, they are basically giving their consent to have future searches without reasonable suspicion or probable cause for the time that they are placed on probation. Next slide. Another exception to the warrant requirement for searches is called plain view, meaning that when police are having contact with citizens, they can search if there appears to be evidence of a crime that's plainly or clearly visible to the police, and the police have to be lawfully present at the location where the evidence is seen. An example of that would be, say, for instance, during a traffic stop, police pull over a citizen for speeding, and while making that contact with the citizen, they see, say, for instance, drug paraphernalia, like a baggie and a pipe that is clearly seen on the passenger side of the car. Then the police can articulate that they are conducting a search because of the plain view exception, because they see evidence of a crime that is plainly visible to them during the contact. And once again, police have to be lawfully present at the location to use the plain view exception. So as an example, if the police enter a residence and it turns out that they didn't have probable cause to enter that residence, and then they see, say, for instance, evidence of a crime like drug paraphernalia or whatever the case may be, then that would be subject to exclusion, because the argument can be made that the police were not lawfully present at the location when the evidence was seen. Okay, next slide. Another exception to the warrant requirement is that it's called it's incident to arrest. Search incident to arrest, and that's when the police can search a person and the area immediately surrounding them or that person during and after a lawful arrest to ensure for the police safety and to prevent the destruction of evidence. And what does this mean? That means that the police can search a person and that person's immediate surrounding area after a lawful arrest. So as an example, if a person is arrested for driving under the influence and their vehicle is searched at the time, the search could be considered incident to lawful arrest. Once again, the officers would have to articulate the reasons for doing so, but the search is limited to the arrestee's person and the area within their immediate control. which is the space where that person could potentially reach and grab a weapon or destroy evidence. When a person is arrested in or near a vehicle, the search can extend to the passenger compartment, but only if the arrestee is within reaching distance or the officer has reason to believe that the vehicle contains evidence of a crime. And again, everything relating to this Fourth Amendment analysis, whether it be reasonable suspicion or probable cause, there's no one size fits all. It always depends on the totality of the circumstances and what the police officers can articulate about that specific encounter. In California, in general, police cannot search a cell phone without a warrant, even if it is incident to lawful arrest. The Supreme Court, the California Supreme Court established this in a case called Riley versus California, recognizing the unique nature and privacy concerns associated with cell phones. So that's very general. But once again, if the police can articulate reasons why they believe they needed to search that cell phone, then that would be considered by the court. Okay, next slide. The exigent circumstances. So this is also an exception to the general warrant requirement, and it's probably the exception that applies most of all the exceptions. And what this does is that it allows police officers to enter a home or conduct a search when there is compelling need for action and no time to secure a warrant. Generally, this applies to emergency situations, such as potential for harm to individuals, destruction of evidence, or escape of a suspect. Generally, the case law, as it relates to exigent circumstances, states that the police need to be able to establish and articulate imminent danger to life or property, the risk of a suspect destroying evidence, hot pursuit of a fleeing suspect. As an example, exigent circumstances often apply in cases where police have to act immediately for the safety of others, such as protecting victims during a domestic violence situation, providing medical emergency aid. An example would be a case called Brigham City versus Stewart. And in that case, the courts found that the police may enter a home without a warrant when they have objective and reasonable basis to believe that there is an immediate danger to occupants, officers, or the public. How exigent circumstances are determined is the objective reasonableness test. And that means that the courts will evaluate the facts and circumstances that would lead a reasonable officer to believe that there is an emergency and therefore an immediate need to act and no time to secure a warrant. The exigent or emergency aspect requires that there's no time for the police to obtain a warrant before the emergency situation escalates or is resolved. And, once again, emergency or exigent circumstances are evaluated on a case-by-case basis, considering the specific facts and circumstances of each case. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to go back to the general topic of traffic stops and reasonable suspicion to justify traffic stops. So police officers can stop citizens for traffic violations, such as speeding, erratic driving, such as swerving, disobeying traffic signals, such as running a red light, equipment violations, such as, no license plate displayed, overly tinted windows. and other observable factors that indicate that there is some type of a violation of the law. Also, in certain circumstances, third-party complaints, given the totality of the circumstances, can also justify a traffic stop. So what that basically means is that, as an example, if citizens call 911 reporting a possible intoxicated driver or reckless driving, and the citizen describes the vehicle, describes what the vehicle was doing that was a violation of the law, then the police can respond to that. And if they can articulate the totality of the circumstances, including their own observations of the of evidence of a crime, such as swerving, which would be consistent with intoxicated driver, then that could be a factor for officers to justify a traffic stop. Okay, next slide. The length of a traffic stop. This often comes up in many lawsuits and cases. And generally what the law states is that officers cannot extend a traffic stop beyond the time needed to complete the task associated with the initial violation unless they have reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity. If officers develop reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity during a stop, they can prolong the detention. But again, they have to have specific and articulatable facts taken together with rational inferences from those facts that reasonably warrant the suspicion. Again, case-by-case analysis. Some recent cases that discuss this in California is a case called California versus Gorgie in 2023. In that case, the police received a tip that a suspect driver acted suspiciously in a motel known for drug trafficking. The police went and observed a driver that matched the description that was provided to the police during the tip. The police pulled the suspect over because they saw the suspect making an unsafe lane change. And the police officer used his narcotic detention dog to sniff the trunk's exterior. The police dog alerted, signaling that it detected odor of narcotics inside the trunk's cabin. In a subsequent search of the truck, officers found methamphetamine, a pipe, a handgun, and ammunition. The suspect brought a motion to suppress based on a Fourth Amendment violation, arguing that this detention violated the Fourth Amendment because officers detoured from the purpose of the stop, which was to issue the ticket for the unsafe lane change and therefore prolong the detention. However, the court denied this motion, and after trial, the suspect was convicted of possession of methamphetamine and drug paraphernalia. The Court of Appeal noted that what began as a lawful traffic stop violated the Fourth Amendment shield against unreasonable seizures when the officers detoured from the traffic stop mission by conducting the dog sniff and inquiring into matters unrelated to the traffic violation. The Court of Appeals noted that the first 5 minutes of the stop involved questions unrelated to the traffic violation, and it took 12 minutes for the dog to sniff the truck. However, next slide, please. That ruling was based upon the facts of that case, but there's a whole line of case law that talks about pretext stops that authorize pretext stops. So what is a pretext stop? When an officer stops a vehicle for a traffic violation, but the primary reason for the stop is to investigate a different crime for which the officer at that time lacks probable cause or reasonable suspicion. Pretext stops are not per se unconstitutional pursuant to the US Supreme Court, because that the stop is always going to be an objective analysis to determine whether or not the stop was reasonable objectively. And California law is consistent with the federal standard. So as an example, the US Supreme Court ruled that pretextual stops are not unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. California courts have taken a somewhat more nuanced approach, but it's not inconsistent with that general ruling. So in California, pretext stops, when evaluating pretext stops, the courts balance between the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and the need for effective law enforcement. And while the US Supreme Court has held that pretext stops are not inherently constitutional, California courts and the legislature are increasingly focusing on transparency and accountability in traffic stops. AB 2773 requires officers to state the reason for the stop before asking further questions. This has been codified within the Vehicle Code 2806.5, which requires peace officers to state the reason for a traffic stop before asking drivers other questions, which originally was aimed to reduce pretext stops. A recent case that evaluated this Vehicle Code section is a case called People versus Valley that was in 2024. And in that case, officers saw a suspect at a gas station and knew the suspect was a known gang member. The officers saw no front license plate, decided to do a pretext stop. And the stop was based upon issuing a ticket for a missing license plate that's required by the Vehicle Code. So officers stopped the individual for the missing license plate. And 3 minutes later, the canine officer arrived because the canine officer was previously called. And the canine dog took about 4 minutes to sniff the car and alerted to the driver's door. The suspect was notified of the alert. The officers searched the center console and found a loaded handgun. The trial court granted the suspect's motion to suppress the evidence due to a pretext stop and cited the legislation that I talked about, Vehicle Code Section 2806.5. The court found that the stop was unduly prolonged and pretextual and dismissed the case. However, the court found that the Vehicle Code Section 2806.5 does not prohibit pretext stops that otherwise meet the Fourth Amendment standard. The court found that the traffic stop was not unduly prolonged, even if it was slightly delayed to allow the canine to arrive. If the total time between the stop and the canine sniff was reasonable, and the sniff revealed additional information justifying further investigation. So as you can see, whether or not traffic stops, pretext stops, whether or not they violate the Fourth Amendment really is on a case-by-case analysis. There's no specific time, 3 minutes versus 6 minutes versus 10 minutes. It really is up to the officers to be able to articulate the reasonable suspicion for the stop or probable cause for the search later. And it is, once again, based upon a totality of the circumstances on an objective standard. Okay, next slide, please. Now, if the criminal court finds a Fourth Amendment violation, so as an example, if in one of those traffic stop cases that I talked to you about, if the criminal court found that the officers did not have reasonable suspicion for the stop or probable cause for the search, then finding a gun or any other evidence of the crime would be subject to the exclusionary rule, which states that illegally obtained evidence cannot be used against the subject in a criminal court. And the purpose of this is to deter illegal searches. Okay, next slide, please. So police use of force is the subject of many lawsuits. Particularly, in the recent years, there's been really an upswing in these police use of force lawsuits. And police officers and the analysis of police officers' use of force under the Fourth Amendment. So how the courts normally go about this is that the rule is that police officers can use reasonable force to either effect an arrest, prevent escape, or overcome resistance. Officers do not need to use lesser intrusive force options that may be ineffective or not feasible before using reasonable force. There's no requirement to use best or most reasonable force, only objectively reasonable force. And so this is important and has been a topic of much discussion, as I stated, in the last few years, because many times you'll hear on the news or people arguing that police officers used more force than was necessary, or that the police didn't need to use force, they should have done something else, and that it was unnecessary or not needed to be done at that time. But that's really not the standard. Under the Fourth Amendment, once again, police can use reasonable force, and it's not necessary force or the best force. It only has to be objectively reasonable. The exception is that when using deadly force, the legislature has recently included language that before using deadly force, that the force the courts can consider whether or not that deadly force was necessary. However, for non-deadly force, the standard is still objectively reasonable. And what does that mean for police officers and during their citizen contacts and use of force is that a police officer who makes or attempts to make an arrest does not need to retreat or desist from his efforts by reason of the resistance or threatened resistance of the person being arrested. Police officers are not going to be deemed the aggressor due to a use of force. And police officers do not lose their right to self-defense by the use of reasonable force to effectuate an arrest, prevent escape, or overcome resistance. And many times in the lawsuits, these use of force lawsuits, the argument is always that, police officers should have not used force until force was used against them. That's not the law. Or that police officers cannot shoot unless they're first shot at. So that's not the law. Once again, the analysis is whether the police officer's use of force was objectively reasonable at the time that the force was used. Okay, next slide, please. And the case, it's a Supreme Court case that defined what is objectively reasonable. When is the use of force under the Fourth Amendment by police officers permitted? Force, once again, is judged from the objective reasonable standard. The courts look at the officer's actions, not the officer's intent. The calculus of reasonableness and the language used is it must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments and decisions in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. And here's that same language again, totality of the circumstances is reviewed in judging an officer's use of force. Next slide, please. And the perspective is, the courts will look at the perspective of a reasonable officer in that police officer's shoes, with similar experience at the time of the use of force. The use of force is examined through the eyes of an officer on the scene at the time the force was applied, and not the 2020 vision of hindsight, because that would be unfair, obviously, to judge officers using 2020 hindsight for decisions they have to make, split-second decisions during these rapidly evolving events. And reasonableness is judged on the facts and circumstances confronting the officer without regard to the officer's underlying intent or motivation. Okay, next slide, please. Now, citizens have duties during their contacts with police officers. We went over this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to go over it again in this context with use of force. Whether officers are detaining a citizen to investigate the officer's reasonable suspicion or to issue a citation, citizens have an obligation to stop. Citizens have no right to resist a lawful detention. If citizens do not stop, they can violate Penal Code Section 148, again, for obstructing, delaying the officer in the performance of that officer's duties. And the officer may use reasonable physical force to overcome that resistance and gain compliance. And again, officers are permitted to use reasonable force to effect a detention or arrest. There's also another penal code section, that's Penal Code Section 69A, that states that every person who attempts by means of any threat or violence to deter or prevent an officer from performing any duty imposed by that officer by law, or who knowingly resists the use of force or by violence of the officer in performance of their duty, can be guilty of a violation of Penal Code Section 69, which can be a felony. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to Fifth Amendment. So the Fifth Amendment guarantees citizens certain rights. One of them is to a grand jury indictment for serious crimes, the right to against double jeopardy, which means that you can only be tried for a crime once, the right to remain silent, to not incriminate yourself, and the right to due process and fair compensation. So those are the general rights that citizens are guaranteed under the Fifth Amendment. Next slide, please. Miranda versus Arizona is the main case. There's been many cases that followed that talk about the rights of citizens before a custodial interrogation. So police must inform the suspects of certain rights before a custodial interrogation. And that would be a situation where the citizen is not free to leave, such as such as an interrogation in a police station, or if the suspect is otherwise told you're not free to leave, then the police have to Mirandize or give the Miranda warnings to these individuals. And those warnings are the right to remain silent, the right to counsel, and if they can't afford counsel, then the state will provide counsel, and also that anything that you say can be used against you. So statements that are made without Miranda when it's required, again, under a custodial interrogation, they can be deemed inadmissible and can't be used against the individual in court. Next slide. In criminal court. So invoking and waiving rights under Miranda, So citizens can invoke their rights after they're read their Miranda rights by saying, I want to remain silent, I don't want to speak to you, or I want a lawyer. And once again, under the totality of the circumstances, if the court determines that the person has invoked their Miranda rights, then the police must stop questioning right away. However, if the individual starts talking and doesn't invoke their rights, then it is a waiver of their rights. It can be considered a waiver of their rights. And once again, the totality of the circumstances is examined. Okay, next slide, please. So violation of these constitutional rights, once again, can result in exclusion of evidence against the person in criminal court. Evidence that was illegally obtained can be excluded and can't be used against an individual in criminal court. But also violation of constitutional rights can result in a civil rights lawsuit that the individual can file against the entity, so the city, and can file against individual officers. And most of these lawsuits are brought under, in federal court, under a section, it's called 1983 lawsuits. It's under the 42 US Code 1983. And these are lawsuits for violation of civil rights. They can stem from various claims, such as search and seizure. These are the most common, excessive force. And there's also claims that can be made against the entity, and they're called Monell. I'll go into those a little bit more in detail later, but there are claims against the entity, generally alleging that the individual's constitutional rights were violated because the entity had an unconstitutional custom, policy, or practice, or failed to train the officers who committed the underlying constitutional violation, or the entity ratified the officer's unlawful conduct. So the Monell liability stems from a case called Monell versus Department of Social Services, and that established that local governments can be sued under Section 1983 for constitutional violations caused by their employees due to, once again, official policies, procedures, or customs, failure to train or ratification. So under these lawsuits, individuals can sue for damages, money damages, declaratory relief or injunctive relief when they claim that when they can prove that their rights have been violated due to either the underlying constitutional violation or Monell violation. Okay, next slide. So individuals can sue the police officer, the underlying police officer who they allege committed the violation of their constitutional rights. They can sue the city, the entity, or the police department. And examples of these lawsuits would be when citizens allege that they were illegally searched and seized, or excessive force was used against them. And this includes cases, from handcuffing cases, detention cases, all the way to officer-involved shooting cases, in custody death cases, and more recently, protest cases. As I noted earlier, my main practice involves defending these lawsuits against the city, the police department, and individual officers. The Section 1983 is a federal statute, and this allows individuals to sue when they allege that officers acted under color of law and violated their individual civil rights. Color of law just means that the police officer was acting within their official duties or within their authority. And the deprivation of rights needs to be specific to the defendant's actions having violated a federal constitutional or statutory right of the plaintiff. For these lawsuits, attorney's fees are normally the drivers in these lawsuits, the tail that wags the dog, so to speak. What many people don't know is, and we can't argue this in California in trial, is that if the jury finds a violation, a constitutional violation, and awards even $1 in damages to the individual who's suing for any type of 1983 violation, then the plaintiff's attorney can get all of their attorney's fees paid by the defendant. So, this is really a driver in a lot of these cases. And in California, the courts have approved recently up to $1,500 an hour for an experienced plaintiff's attorney's fees. And the plaintiff's attorneys can have a crew of people working on the case. And generally, all the fees that they allege and claim are awarded. And what that means it is in most 1983 cases, by the time that trial is concluded, attorney's fees alone can be minimum, $1 million and up. And I know of cases where attorney's fees were approved by the court upwards of $4 million, depending on the case, depending on what was done. It's a great motivator for plaintiffs' attorneys to take these types of cases because, once again, if the plaintiff is awarded even $1, they can get all of their attorney's fees paid for their work. Next slide, please. So regarding a 1983 excessive force claim, once again, the officer has to be acting under color of law. Their actions had to have been intentional. The officer's acts need to have caused the deprivation of the plaintiff's constitutional rights. And the officer must have unreasonably seized the plaintiff's person by using excessive force. The same actions of excessive force can also be brought in state court under negligence claims such as negligence battery or negligence wrongful death. However, in state court, plaintiffs can't recover attorney's fees on negligence claims. So generally, that's why these cases are brought in federal court because of the attorney's fee, the ability to recover attorney's fees. If the plaintiff, however, in state court or in federal court alleges what they call a Bain Act, then they can recover attorney's fees based upon that. And that is when the jury finds that the officer intentionally interfered with a constitutional right, and the interference was by means of threat, intimidation, or coercion, that the officer intended to violate the plaintiff's rights. Generally, it's known as malicious behavior or black heart behavior. That's how it has been categorized. So excessive force lawsuits, like I said earlier, can range from using excessive force during handcuffing all the way to officer-involved shootings. Okay, next slide. Another Section 1983 lawsuit that can be brought is the First Amendment retaliation claim. This happens most recently in protest cases, wherein there's claims relating to excessive force that officers use during protests, such as using less lethal weapons to control the crowd, or using any other type of force during a protest. And so many of those cases involve First Amendment retaliation claims. And the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom to protest. And so the claim for First Amendment retaliation is that the plaintiffs have to prove that they were engaging in constitutional protected activity, that the officer's use of force would chill a person of ordinary firmness from continuing to engage in protected activity, and the plaintiff's protected activity was a substantial motivating factor in the officer's conduct. These lawsuits have really exploded since the summer of 2020. And since that time, I would estimate that close to 40% of my cases have involved protest cases. Okay, and next slide, please. And the last topic I wanted to cover was the Section 1983 lawsuit, the federal lawsuit. It's a Monell claim against the entity. So this is where the police department and the city can be sued based upon the alleged actions against individual officers. And what that means is that the city or the police department can be sued for the actions of their employees under certain conditions. And so once again, in all of these different lawsuits, whether it be based on custom, policy, or practice, failure to train, or ratification, the plaintiff has to prove that the officer was acting under color of law, meaning within his official capacity as a police officer, and they have to prove an underlying constitutional violation. So as an example, in a use of force case, the plaintiff would have to prove that the officer was acting within his official capacity as a police officer and that he used force which violated the individual's constitutional rights against unreasonable or excessive force. So in order to prove a Monell claim against the entity based on custom, policy, or practice, in addition to the underlying constitutional violation, the plaintiff has to prove that the officer acted pursuant to an expressly adopted official policy or widespread practice, custom of the city. And they also have to prove that it was this policy, practice, or custom that caused the deprivation of the plaintiff's rights. The second theory against the entity is failure to train. So once again, the plaintiff would have to prove the underlying constitutional violation by the individual police officer. And they would also have to prove that the officer acted pursuant to expressly adopted official policy, custom, or practice. Oh, I'm sorry. That they would have to prove that the officer, that there were training policies within the city that were not adequate to train its officers, and that the city was deliberately indifferent to the known and obvious consequences of its failure to train, and that the failure to train caused the deprivation of the individual's constitutional rights. The last theory of liability against the entity under Monell is ratification. And once again, they have to prove the underlying constitutional violation, and the plaintiffs also have to prove that a final policymaker, that's usually the chief of police, ratified the officer's acts, meaning knew of and specifically made a deliberate choice to approve the acts and the basis of the act. Okay, and that concludes my presentation. I have time for any questions that anybody may have.
I have a question. I did a little research a while back about, well, as you may know or may not know, that we're kind of overrepresented in Vallejo on officer-involved shootings. And I did some research about and found that the Supreme Court has said words to the effect that police officers have to make split-second decisions, and so putting in my own language, they deserve a break or something. But maybe you could speak on that. I think it's important for us to know about this on the police commission.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, so the language that you're referring to is actually in Graham versus Connor and all of the cases, there's a whole line of cases that address the reasonableness of force, both federally and in California. And that's absolutely correct, is that the courts are not going to look at the 2020 hindsight that may be reviewed after the officer involved shooting. Many of these lawsuits, I can tell you, involve cases where we have body-worn videos or civilian testimony that involve events that occurred, over maybe a 3 or 4 minute period, where officers had to make split-second decisions, that are rapidly evolving, stressful, and decisions that involve life or death within a very short period of time. And so the courts do say that, officers don't have the ability or luxury like a jury would have to look at a video and rewind it and, look at the first second, the second second, the third second, and then answer questions like, well, could I have done this? Could I have used that? What if, and many of these cases involve cases where police officers see guns and maybe later on it turns out that it's not a functional gun or it was a toy gun. But, courts say that just because it may turn out later to be a non-functioning gun or a fake gun, that wasn't known to the officer at the time. So only the information known to the officers at the time is used to judge whether or not the officer's use of force, and in this case, deadly force, was reasonable, objectively reasonable at the time. So the courts do say that you have to consider that officers do have to make, very quick split-second decisions during rapidly evolving situations, and that's to be given serious consideration, and that once again, it's objectively what would a similarly situated officer in that officer's shoes, whether or not it was reasonable for the officer to use the force at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I have a question.
Sure.
This had to do with your the story you told about the pretext stop. And I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say that the suspect that they stopped was in a gas station getting gas? Did I understand that correctly? I just want to make sure I heard that correctly.
Yes, so I think we're talking about the case where the officers had received a tip that the suspect was a known gang member and had guns and some other criminal behavior. So the officers responded to the gas station and they saw the individual at the gas station, but they didn't stop him in the gas station. So they observed him at the gas station and then they followed him. And they made the stop based upon a violation of the vehicle code. I believe it was like missing plates, and that was the basis for the stop. And so when they say pretext stop, the violation of the vehicle code does justify the stop. But the officers, when they say pretext, was that in their mind, they were actually wanted to investigate a more serious crime, which was the gang member having weapons and I believe also drugs. And so that's why it was called a pretext stop. But so long as the officers were able to visualize the individual actually committing a crime, such as a violation of the vehicle code section, then the stop is legally justified.
Okay, that's clarifying because I don't remember hearing you may have said it that he actually left the gas station, and the reason for the stop was the missing license plate, which a lot of times these individuals are stopped for minor things like that lead to big arrests. The other thing that you said had to do with warrant requirements, and this is where I personally have challenges when it says when the judge says an officer believes.
Okay.
So an officer, it seems like, just listening to your explanation, it just seems like if an officer is believed by a judge, a person doesn't have a chance. And we've known of many cases when officers have stated they believed, and a lot of times it's led to tragedies. And because of what they believe, and sometimes what they believe is just to solidify a warrant that may not be based on strong belief. I guess it's the safest way to say it, but just a way to get inside a property. And we all know about the Breonna Taylor case in Kentucky that happened, where they said the officer believed, that turned into a tragedy in so many ways. So for me personally, the statement that a judge believes over an officer, when sometimes, and we've kind of discussed this before, that there is sometimes a bias involved, and they can sell the pitch, well, I believe. Because the belief is not always based on accurate information. It's just it's just, I guess you could say, a thought, but not necessarily based on accurate or true information. I'm just stating what my thoughts are on that.
Well, no, and I certainly appreciate the comment, and I think that your concern and your comments are shared by, members of the public, many members of the public who have concerns about, the propriety of the justice system and, judges and police. So I certainly appreciate the comment. I think that it's actually not just, that officers can't just go into court and say, well, I believe X. And, that's that. Once again, to establish probable cause, the officers have to be able to articulate specific facts that lead to their reasonable suspicion or probable cause. So I can tell you that particularly in California, and that's the federal standard, that you have to be able to articulate those specific facts. I can tell you that in California, that the courts are even more restrictive than federal courts in how they interpret that. And once again, everything is a case-by-case analysis. There's no way to say, if officers have A, B, C, and D, then that's probable cause. The courts have to review everything. But I do think that in California, that the courts are, for lack of a better term, more strict, I think, in demanding these articulable and specific facts to justify reasonable suspicion or probable cause under the circumstances. And in my experience, it hasn't been my experience that in California, the courts, like rubber stamp, I guess, what the police officers say. It's been my experience that, courts are very critical, and there's plenty of case law out there where courts have found when, that police officers, they didn't believe that they articulated specific facts that would justify reasonable suspicion or probable cause for the stop or search.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had 2 quick questions related to your section on citizens' rights during a
Sure.
stop. The first question is related to officer disclosure of the stop and frisk. Are officers required to disclose if a citizen were to ask why they were being stopped and frisked, or could they, choose to not disclose that reason and then later on articulate a good reason for the stop and frisk?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, but the answer generally is yes. So if during the stop and frisk, the officer can articulate why it was not feasible to articulate the reason for the stop at that time, then it may not be required at that time. So say, for instance, if it was a rapidly evolving situation and they had a tactical situation in front of them, they had to get the individual, in handcuffs immediately because they believe that there was some immediate danger, officer safety, or danger to others, or it was going to somehow hinder their investigation, then they don't have to disclose, at that time. So at the moment they're being handcuffed, you are being handcuffed because of X, Y, and Z. So, so it would depend on what the officers could articulate. But generally, yes, once it's feasible and safe to do so, then officers should articulate the reasons for the stop.
Thank you. And quickly, what about are plainclothed or undercover officers allowed to conduct sort of a stop and frisk of that nature? And what's sort of the mechanism for disclosure that's required? Like, I could kind of envision a scenario where somebody sees people in plain clothes and is not convinced that they're police officers, or flees under the idea of safety, and then maybe that leads to some of the complications that you outlined with fleeing from an officer, a citizen. It seems like maybe a bit of a gray area, and I wonder if there's any legal precedent or discussion around that.
Yes, so what you're describing is more of a defense for an individual who, may be accused of fleeing or not obeying an officer's lawful commands. But generally, yes, officers who are in plain clothes or undercover, they still have the authority to stop and detain individuals the same manner as a uniformed officer would have that same authority. But, in the context of that, if they don't identify themselves or properly identify themselves, and the individual has a concern that's not a real officer, for their safety, and if the individual, doesn't comply at that moment, but gives an alternative, then the individual would have a good defense, right? As to, I didn't believe that was genuinely an officer, and I had a concern. And it's interesting you bring that up, because I did have a case wherein an individual was stopped by a detective for a traffic violation, speeding, I believe, and swerving. And the officer was in plain clothes and in a detective car, which is an unmarked car. So it's not like a black and white that has sirens. And the officer stopped that individual, and the individual was a female. And the officer said, "Hi, I'm an officer. Here's my identification. And, I saw you swerving and committing traffic violations. Can you please give me your ID?" And the individual said, "I don't know if I can be sure that you are an officer. I mean, you show me a badge, but people can get badges off of eBay. And I don't feel safe. I'm a female. I'm on the side of the road. There's nobody else here. And, is it okay if you follow me to the nearest gas station or a 7-Eleven, and then I'll talk to you there?" And then so, the officer gave some resistance to that and delayed the stop, but eventually said, "Okay, fine." And then the individual did drive to a gas station, and the police officers made contact with the individual there. And the individual, had a really good, I think, argument to say that, she was acting reasonable and meant to comply with, a request from the officers, but she did have a genuine concern that she was, in the road at night. There weren't other people around. Anybody can get a badge. And it was reasonable for her, certainly, to say, "I don't feel safe. Can you please follow me to, somewhere an open area like a gas station?" And so, once again, I think that's in that context, for individuals, that could be reasonable to do, once again, depending on the totality of the circumstances.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
We've had at least one person come before us and say that her brother was murdered by the police here, but the officer was apparently, I don't know if exonerated is the right word. No charges were filed, but maybe every county is different, but would the district attorney be the one to decide whether or not charges are filed?
Yes, that's a very good question. So regarding criminal offenses such as homicide, then the district attorney would be the decision maker on whether or not criminal charges will be filed for homicide. And in the situation that you've described, if the family member, sister, whoever it may be, says that police officers murdered my brother, family member, then that would be up to the district attorney's office to investigate, and they would make a determination as to whether or not criminal charges should be filed against that officer for homicide. And that would be up to the DA's office to do. And separately, that individual, the sister, could also bring a civil lawsuit for wrongful death or, violation of excessive force in federal court or wrongful death in state court or both, against the police officer, for violation of the decedent's constitutional rights to be free from excessive force.
Thank you. Because I've argued with people online about this, and I make the point that the district attorney probably doesn't know any police officer in Vallejo. So why would they risk their license and reputation and everything else to exonerate a police officer?
Right. I mean, clearly, once again, I think that California particularly is very critical of police officers in the way that the courts review police officers' uses of force and actions, much more critical than other states, much more critical than the federal standards. I will say that, you know, district attorneys, not only do they have to make their determinations as to whether or not a crime was committed, within the criminal law, but also, there is oversight for what the district attorneys do as well. And, California particularly is very, transparent. Individuals are entitled to obtain certain materials relating particularly to officer-involved shootings, under CIPRA. And so, everything is very transparent. And I think that, everything is looked through with a critical lens. And definitely, I was a district attorney for 9 years, and I don't know of any district attorney who would put their law license and, livelihood on the line to protect an officer, particularly with all of the oversight and, that is, and the lens that is on district attorneys.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other
Actually,
questions?
I do have a question, but I don't know if it's actually directed to you or to Randy and Veronica. The question that I have is the city does have a lot of 1983 cases. How does that impact our investigation for a similar incident that we come in front of? And then the other question that I has is the objective reasonable standard also apply to us as well when we're doing our investigation of incidents?
So two things. One, it shouldn't in terms of whether or not we have a past case. Every case is on its own merits. Every incident is on its own merits. The standards apply universally across the board to each incident separately. So to the extent that you're looking at a case that already exists, unless there's, a evidence and or an alleged pattern and practice that has similar things have gone on, et cetera, no, you would not be looking at what a past incident was unless it involved, of course, potentially the same officer. With regard to your second question, which really was, you might have to repeat it.
Just
Sorry.
whether or not the objective reasonable standard also applies when we do our investigation for
Well,
harms.
you don't do an investigation.
Well,
So,
okay.
yeah,
But is
and
that the-
not to say that dramatically, but it's, we will have, investigations are done. With regard to the incidents that come before this body that are serious, what we call serious incidents under the ordinance, and they're defined, then to that extent, the independent investigator investigates those incidents, reaches conclusions of fact, looks to the policies and potential policy violation, and then those conclusions come before this body for you to review and make recommendations on. But to the extent that it is the same standard, correct, the investigator applies that standard, and then this body applies that standard in making the recommendation.
Will there ever be an instance where an investigation that we're doing, I assume, I think I might know the answer, but would a civil lawsuit ever stem out of it during our investigation of a case? I mean, it's possible, but
It is absolutely possible. So there could be a situation where a case could already be filed and pending before our investigation is concluded. It's not necessarily true, but it could occur that immediately somebody sees something, has an incident and says, all right, well, I'm going to file on my incident before we ever have, we'll get a claim first and then we'll get a case. And the incident may still, and this happens, I would say a fair percentage of the time, be under its external or independent investigation, or even that case could precede the internal review because there's two prongs to that. So yes, it's possible. But it shouldn't influence this body's decision in any way, or recommendation in any way. We don't let the filing of those cases influence the investigations either, so they're kept completely separate.
thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
Any other questions? Yeah. Any other questions for Lisa?
Miss Lee, you must have been admitted to the bar when you were 15 years old. From the sounds of your history, you don't look a day over 35.
Well, thank you. That's my favorite comment of the night. Thank you so much.
All righty. Well, thank you very much for your presentation this evening. We appreciate all of your work that went into this, and thank you for coming and staying with us so late into the evening tonight. So with that, I know, thanks. With that, I think we do have one public speaker card from a very patient Dr. Schessel, who has waited this evening. This is a special meeting, Dr. Schessel, so your comments would need to relate to the training measures that were before us this evening.
I don't see a clock, so I don't. All right. I'll try to make this brief. I think before this group does anything, you need to start contacting the city council liaison that you have, your council member, your district council member, and the city manager, and get this committee functioning. I think you need to insist that the committee be allowed to organize even if the city and VPOA hasn't come to a final agreement. And there's a lot of things that you can do before investigating new complaints and have nothing to do with meet and confer or whatever decisions the city comes up with. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things because it goes along with some of the training. You need bylaws. And I think in your bylaws, from my experience on all the committees I've been on, the city, do not give staff the power to unilaterally cancel meetings or dictate the agendas. You're supposed to be independent. And if you allow them to have that kind of control, you're not independent anymore. And as each part of an agenda, you need to have a new business section so that the public and committee members can suggest topics and they be maintained on a pending agenda list. What happens is if you don't have a pending agenda list, they go into a dark hole and they just are kind of forgotten. And if it's important enough that you brought it up for a new meeting, new business, it ought to be held somewhere. You need to push for hiring an independent auditor. And you might think one of the things that I said earlier in my paper that I gave you is always ask, where's it written? You're going to be told you can't do this or you got to do that. A lot of times what it really is an opinion. And if you ask for why you can't do it, they can't show you on paper, so you must ask that question. You need that outreach for a youth member. And something that I was just thinking of after listening to everything, you need to consider have a non-voting representative from the police department. I think that's a fault right now, that this could, because that person sometimes can really be helpful in giving you information. You need to have a permanent commission secretary, and I think you need to, at least for a while, educate the public with different speakers. I gave you a list of them, from John Burris to ACLU, et cetera. And you need to have community sessions to learn about what's going on in the community and the best way that these people feel that they can be reached, not the way you think they can be reached. And I'll stay within my time limit. Thank you.
Okay, any other speakers, any other commenters? No, okay. Manny, do we have any online commenters on the training this evening?
No online speakers at this time.
Thank you. All right, well, with that, I'll just remind the commission, you're done with phase one. So congratulations. Hey, we got a clap out of that one. Thank you all for your patience and for your attendance and your great questions and your interest and your service. So with that, as I noted at the beginning of this meeting this evening, we'll be looking for the chief's additional trainings to be coming forward, things that he'd like for you. Kind of goes a little bit to Dr. Schussel's, two of his comments actually, this evening. And so the chief will be reaching out and getting that information out to us through to you. We will also be looking to do any other trainings that you all think. So that is an opportunity under the ordinance as well. But we will be looking forward to giving you an update on where we are with the implementation, and we will keep you updated on that information as we kind of close out this process and hopefully reach a active commission in the shortest term possible.
I'm sorry, Veronica. Andrew has his hand up and he would like to speak.
Oh, well, I can't see Andrew because he's not on any of these screens, but go, Andrew.
All right. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I appreciated the trainings and have really appreciated the commissioners' engagement in this process. It's a lot of information to digest, and we still have the next round, but have really enjoyed this, and thanks for letting me participate.
Great. In the meantime, if any of the commission members, again, use this opportunity after tonight's meeting to catch up on any that you missed and view the videos. And as I said, we'll send those links out to you as soon as our IT division has got them all available in an easy format for you to click on and watch. And we will send you the forms for verifying that you have done so. If I'm not sure if anybody hasn't missed at least one. Maybe Commissioner Hybels, you haven't missed any, I think. And I'm not sure, and neither is Commissioner Roy. So there you go. Two of you do not have homework in that regard. But at the end of at the conclusion of that process, I do want to make sure that we keep you updated as to where we are. So if we're not in touch, keeping you updated as to where we are, please reach out. If you have any further questions, please reach out. We'll be happy to address those issues. The comments about staff being appointed, et cetera, we'll be working on that, and we'll give you updates on where we are as we give you updates on where we are with the ordinance. So with that, thank you. And we are adjourned at, I don't know, 9 something, 9:17.